The lecture I'm going to give for this portion of our kind of topic lecture series is Political Economic History of the U.S. Why are we doing this? Because in order to understand the redistribution of economic resources, we think that it is useful for you to understand some of the story of how economic resources have been distributed historically in the United States, right? So like redistribution, that means that we got to understand distribution, okay? So that's the purpose here, is that many of the arguments that you'll be reading, because they are economic arguments, they will presume some degree of familiarity with the course of economic events in the history of the United States. We're going to try and make sure that you can kind of put those in like a general story of U.S. history. I'm not your AP history teacher, like APUSH. I'm not your APUSH teacher. I'm not looking for you to memorize a series of dates. I am looking for you to get some overall sense of kind of like some of the large scale trends and the scope of economic activity in the United States, okay? Some of it will be, I will get into some of the like programmatic history. We will note a couple times when either the antecedents or like original programs like those that you were debating showed up. But it won't go, like I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on the specific history of those programs. I'm going to put them more in an economic context in U.S. history. This is very U.S. focused. There's a little bit of international, but not a ton, okay? I refer to this as a lecture about political economy, okay? To break that down, politics, we'll summarize that as who gets to tell who what they may or must do. Okay? Who gets to tell who what they may or must do? Think about that as the distribution of power. Okay? Some people refer to it sometimes as favoring relationships of command. That is, if I can make you do something or require you to do something, right? That's political power that's oftentimes enforced by law. Economics, we could summarize that as who gets what and how. The distribution of goods and services. Okay? So, politics, economics, political economy. When this is hyphenated, that means that these are a set of people, and I'll talk a little bit about who I'm drawing this from, who say that in order to understand either one of these, either U.S. politics or U.S. economics, that you have to pay attention to the relationships between the two at all times. Okay? That is, there's no economic phenomenon that's detached from politics, in the same way that there's no political phenomenon that's totally detached from economics. So, U.S. political economy. Okay? Just to give you a little bit of background about the perspective that I'm drawing from here. You'll be debating a bunch of different economic theories at different times this year that interpret these economic events in very different ways. So in order to try and understand and learn the like different interpretations that are going on, we have to understand some of the empirics that they're actually going to draw on. So like, what are the historical examples that you are presumed to know? What are these theories attempting to explain, right? It is the characteristic of a good theory that it would explain a number of the historical patterns that we find in U.S. economic history. So that's why we're going to do this background. I'm borrowing very substantially from a book called The Ages of American Capitalism by Jonathan Levy, who's a professor at U-Chicago, though unusually for Chicago, not a conservative. This is his typology, the kind of eras of American political economy that you'll see them appear on different parts of the board. We'll go over some of the different major transitions in the U.S. economy. Okay, this is his typology that's been slightly, I've like modified it just a little bit. Okay, if you're having a little bit of trouble reading in the back, we've got 1660 to 1860, the age of commerce, conquest, and settlement. 1860 to 1932, the age of capital. 1932 to 1980, the age of control. 1980 to now, he refers to as the age of chaos. Okay? So we're going to put these kind of broad eras in conversation with the economic issues about distribution and redistribution that we find in the topic. So we're going to start with the first age that he discusses, commerce, conquest, and settlement. Okay? It's important to understand that the U.S. started out as a colonial economy. Okay? It's an outgrowth of British mercantilism. Okay? A theory, an economic theory of the primarily 17th century, in which the goal is to have your colonies on the periphery, okay, serve as a source of raw materials or inputs for the metropole, the center, the core economy, and that your colonies also serve as a market for refined or manufactured goods. In the case of the United States or the American colonies, this is Britain and London. London is the financial center of the early portions of the American economy. Okay? What's going on economically in the US as a colonial economy? For one, there's a strong emphasis on plantation agriculture. Okay? In particular, tobacco and eventually cotton. Okay? You should think, when you think about plantation agriculture, and we're going to talk a fair amount about slavery and slave capital in a little bit here, but one of the things to note is that this is like it's a speculative investment, okay? The people who are being sent to colonize portions of the United States, they're producing cash crops that are monocropped. So it's like you're going to grow as much as possible of tobacco or cotton to sell on the international market, to serve as an input for manufactured goods in the, like I said, in the metropole, in the core economy. In the case of tobacco, that turns into primarily at the time cigars, right? But it's like this, it's a luxury item. Like, the tobacco is not an old world plant, it's a new world plant. So this is, you can think of this as like a fad or a craze. Like, okay, this smoking thing, it turns out it's pretty addictive. Cotton is an input into textile manufacturing, okay? Like, if you think about it, if you were to, think about the composition of the clothing that everybody here is wearing at the camp, the percentage of us that are wearing cotton clothing, extremely, extremely high. Like, most of the clothing that we're wearing is made out of cotton. If you go back to the 17th century, that would not be accurate, okay? You'd have a lot of stuff made out of linen, flax, like a bunch of textiles that you either don't use very much or that you may, like in the case of flax, you've probably never heard of, okay? That's because cotton is extremely intensive to produce. It's difficult. It only grows in certain areas in the world. It grows extremely well in the American South and the Mid-Atlantic. So monocropping tobacco and cotton can turn into a very profitable enterprise for the people who are sponsoring colonial settlement and colonial expeditions, okay? This is not like, you kind of hear the story of like religious persecution and religious settlement here in New England, okay, in the United States. If you think about the economic development of the colonies, plantation agriculture is very, very different than that. These are speculative investments on the part of already very wealthy people in Britain, okay? What does this mean that the U.S. economy has a bunch of? Land, okay? Land. This is where we get into the conquest component of the age of conquest and commerce and settlement, okay? Why is land so different in the in the American colonies? Excuse me, I keep saying U.S. is just a synonym for both of those. In the American colonies, one of the things that makes this, a very different event in terms of global economic history is that all of the Europeans who are settling and colonizing in the Americas, there's no feudal customs or hereditary consolidation of land ownership in the United States, in the American colonies. And the theory here is that large portions of the Americas can be treated as, quote, terra nullius. Terra nullius, that's Latin. Terra, land, nullius, nothing, okay? As in, this is empty land. It is unclaimed, okay? Now, this conquest part might indicate to you that, like, unclaimed there is a very contested term, right? It's like, it is unclaimed in the sense of the European legal system. There are no recognized private property rights among the English colonists, or like they recognize no title basically until it is incorporated into the British legal system. And it's like the theory here is that because the native and indigenous peoples in the United States or in the Americas have not, quote, improved the land, they don't own it. The land is in an Edenic state. Remember that it's like every single one of these British colonists who is coming across to the Americas, they are all Christians. They have some intra-faith disputes about Christianity, but their political vision is also fundamentally informed by religion. Okay, and that's where you get this quote, John Locke, who I assume that you all have heard about at some point in one of your history classes. Is that accurate? Can somebody tell me who John Locke is? Raise your hand. Go ahead.
He's the tabula rasa guy. That's like all people were born neutral, and then we kind of like gain our opinions based on what we live through.
That is very accurate, but what's the role that he tends to play in the like way that you learn the history of U.S. government?
Oh, okay. So like Jefferson just like copied all of his stuff.
Yeah, like our Constitution is based largely on Lockean principles. Okay, Lockean principles. John Locke is an incredibly important political philosopher in terms of the history of the United States. There's a Locke quote in the second treatise on government, which is, it's like in any of your U.S. history books, you'd see references to the importance of Locke's second treatise on government. It's one of the things that the founders read as a significant document for influencing the U.S. Constitution. Locke's quote, "In the beginning, all the world was America." In the beginning, all the world was America. As in, and he's talking about Eden here, right? Remember, they all have a Christian worldview that informs every other part of their politics and economics. He's referring to like before the fall, okay? Like back in Eden, it was like America, as in it is empty, it is unclaimed, it is unworked, it is unimproved, okay? So there's an enormous amount of land from the perspective of the colonists who are settling in the United States and who are being sponsored to, pursue plantation agriculture in the United States. There is an incredible abundance of land in comparison to Europe, right? At that point, essentially all land in Europe has been claimed or been part of the various elements of the European legal system, including the Roman legal system, for a very, very, very long time. A lot of it is heavily consolidated too, right? So like you have these aristocratic families in Europe that own enormous portions of land. Okay, the English nobility, I don't remember the percentages of land owned by the English nobility in the 17th century, but I can assure you it's very high. Okay, so things work very differently in the colonies in terms of what's scarce and what isn't, and land is not perceived as scarce. Okay. Importantly, in colonization, there are some significant sectional economic divisions. That is, different regions of the country have fundamentally different economic activity. Right? You probably know a little bit of this background already, is my guess, but we're trying to put it together as a little bit more dynamic story. Okay? So, for instance, cotton, tobacco, those are geographically limited. They don't grow everywhere. You can't grow cotton in Vermont. Okay? At no point has like any of the land around New Hampshire or Vermont, like you could walk hundreds of miles in any direction and there's never been any cotton planted here. Same thing with tobacco. Okay? It's like it's all food and kind of like, it's very, very rough agriculture, okay? The fertile soils of the South, there's a lot of agricultural resources that you can use to grow cotton and tobacco. In the North, you have a lot of timber, right? It's like the same thing, you could walk for hundreds of miles here and never encounter a forest that hasn't been chopped all the way down. The amount of old growth timber that still exists in New England is like, there's some pockets on some mountain that it's like, well, it was so hard to get there in 1898 that like those last 50 trees on that hillside, no one ever chopped them down. But like everywhere for hundreds of miles around here at some point, there were no trees, they were all cut down, they were all gone. Like there are pictures of Hanover during the 19th century where you can look from, like the student center or the dining hall where you're standing, you can see the Connecticut River. And like all the trees that are in the way there, none, no trees of any kind, okay? Chopped it all down. Grow food, okay, and provisions that many of these food, kind of like food stocks get sold to the plantations to help provide support for slave labor because growing food is not as profitable as monocropping these very expensive cash crops, okay? Whaling and early manufacturing. So there's a fundamental economic divide from very early on between the northern and southern colonies. Their economies are organized very, very differently. Okay? This also means that in the early republic, so we've skipped ahead now. We're in the 18th century. We're in the founding of the United States. Revolutionary War, okay, that's where we are. That's when we are. Okay? We start to have, there's a fundamental political division in the country that reflects some of these different economic activities and economic interests. You have the Federalists, okay, who they are interested in ensuring the power of the federal government. Federalism is one of those terms that gets used a bunch of different ways at a bunch of different times. In this context, the Federalists are pro-federal power. They want a stronger federal government as opposed to stronger state governments. You have the anti-federalists who eventually consolidate into, I'm painting with broad brush here, so like, your history teachers would want some more details on some of these things, but bear with me. The Democratic Republicans, these two tendencies are, in terms of especially the economic vision for the United States, represented by two very important schools of thought among the founders. Hamilton is one of the primary Federalists. Okay, he is interested in, his vision is heavily informed by building a manufacturing base for the United States, that the U.S., part of forming an independent country on the part of the United States should be to guard itself from being, completely producing only primary goods or raw materials, that it should begin to develop a manufacturing base. As well, he's tied heavily to a number of like New York financial interests. Okay, Jefferson, he's a slaveholder and a plantation owner. Okay, and in large part, like these are northern and southern interests. It's like in the very broad sense, the North, New England, more interested in consolidating its existing hold on manufacturing. The South, much more interested in ensuring the trade in the commodities that it is exporting still, to international markets. Like the cotton doesn't stay in the United States. The U.S. at this point has essentially no capacity to turn cotton into anything. The U.S. sends all the cotton to Britain. This is the British Industrial Revolution, is heavily textile focused. Like the first really large factories in the world are British textile mills. They're turning lots of American cotton into refined goods, clothing, and selling them across the world. Okay? A big part of what this means in terms of the political conflict manifesting itself in economic terms is all of the holders of slave capital, that is the plantation, the plantation economy of the South, they're all exporters to international markets. They have to send the cotton somewhere in order for it to be valuable. Like, it's not valuable as cotton, it's valuable as something that's going to be turned into clothing. So it's got to go to where it can be turned into clothing. They're importers of nearly everything else. Okay? So if you were to go to Monticello or one of these very ornate, elaborate houses, that's Jefferson's plantation, okay? You'd see a lot of imported luxury goods from Europe, because none of that stuff is made in the United States at the time, okay? That means that all of these people are very interested in ensuring that there is a lot of trade, okay, in which they can get their goods to those international markets. All of the financier and manufacturing interests in the North, okay, and once again, painting with broad brush, they are significantly more interested in internal improvements, that is, protecting the goods that they manufacture from international competition. So if you're trying to build a textile mill in the United States, okay, which, once again, if you were to, those of you who came on either the charter bus or the Dartmouth coach, okay, you remember when you were driving through, well, you probably don't, but you drove through Manchester, New Hampshire, okay? It was like one of the only cities in between Boston and Hanover. When you looked around and you're like, oh, there are buildings again, okay? Like that was Manchester. That's Manchester, New Hampshire. You might, if you were paying close attention or just wandering and daydreaming, I don't know, okay? Manchester, New Hampshire, it's a series of enormous brick buildings all along the Merrimack River. Like some of the biggest buildings that you have ever seen. Most of them now are luxury condos, okay? But they're the first sites of major manufacturing in the United States. They're textile mills. They're textile mills that competed with British textiles, okay? If you're trying to compete with British textiles, you don't want a lot of goods imported into the country from your competitors. You want a high tariff, okay? Tariffs are barriers to trade. That is, they're an amount that has to be paid in order for the good to enter into the country that's importing that good. So, for instance, you might want a tariff that has a certain a certain percentage of the value of those British textiles. It's like, we're gonna make it that much more expensive, which makes it easier to compete, right? So you can manufacture textiles that are of the same quality. Maybe, it's like it's more expensive to have certain parts of your factory start up. You're like behind the British in terms of manufacturing technology and stuff. Okay? You need, in order to be able to compete with them, you want a high tariff to keep their goods out. Okay? There is a foundational economic conflict here in terms of the interests of these two groups. Okay? This sectional and regional economic conflict divides the United States from its early history up until now. Like, part of our fiscal redistribution debates and like where inequality occurs in the United States and why is still influenced by this pattern of economic activity. We'll kind of trace it through some of these other ages, but those are some foundational elements of the early U.S. economy. Okay? Does anybody have a question about the tariff? Some of that might be a little tricky. Does that relationship make sense? Like why those people would be button heads on what they want? Are we good with that? Okay. We're fast forwarding. We're fast forwarding to the Civil War. Okay? That is, we are fast forwarding to the moment that this sectional conflict can't be dealt with politically and is instead the cause of a civil war. Okay? The South and the North perceive their economic interests to be so different that there is no way to reconcile them. Lincoln is elected as a Republican in the North, essentially only receiving votes in the North, receives no votes in the South. The South secedes. Okay? There are some very important aspects of the economic history of the U.S. that are at the forefront of the Civil War. Okay, so when Chris was giving his topic lecture, okay, remember when we were talking about capital and labor? What's capital? Money? Kind of, yeah. Okay, machines, technology that you're using to produce. It's like if labor is one of the inputs, then typically capital is regarded as the other. That's like, okay, here's the machine, here's the technology, here's the other factor in production. So the way in which money could serve as capital is as investment capital. That is, you have accumulated wealth that you can see how you could turn that into something that helps you make something else, right? So like machines, they are very expensive. They are very difficult to produce. You typically need a great deal of accumulated wealth or credit in order to invest to produce some new productive process. That's the capital part of this. This part is tricky in terms of the importance of slavery for the U.S. economy because in one sense, slavery functions as a labor input, right? You have people who are enslaved and they are performing extremely difficult labor on I hid that part of the board, but they're performing labor on those same plantations that we just discussed, right? Cotton and tobacco. In terms of the way that the U.S. economy works, there is a way in which you could think of enslaved peoples, and I'm not suggesting that this is like the proper categorization. I'm saying this is the like political economic effect. People as capital. That is, the people who have been capitalized by virtue of being property. That is, they are an investment. If you purchase slaves, you are presuming that you will work them for however long they live. They will produce goods on your behalf. You will sell those goods. Okay? This, in terms of the American economy, at the beginning of the Civil War, 1860, the worth, the total value of enslaved persons in the United States in 1860 dollars is $3 billion. That is greater than all of the other capital stocks in the U.S. combined at the time. Add up all the machines in any of those textile mills, anything that is being manufactured in the North, the total value of people who are enslaved in the South as capital, more valuable than the rest of accumulated capital stocks in the United States. That's when people discuss the importance of slavery to the history of the U.S. economy, that's like, this is a pretty crude number, but it is a very important one to keep in mind for thinking about the evolution of our economy. Okay, At the beginning of the Civil War, the federal government is tiny. Like, you walk around DC now, you see it's like, oh, there are these huge buildings, big departments, like federal agencies everywhere, like a bunch of acronyms that you might or might not remember from your history book. Okay? At this point, the federal government it's a drop in the bucket. It has very few people. It has almost no revenue. In fact, the only real revenue that the federal government collects at that time is the tariff. The federal government controls international trade, okay? Because it controls international trade, it collects tariffs. So when goods come into the United States, they go to the custom house and they pay the dues, the customs and duties, okay, if you've ever, like the duty-free shop, they don't get to skip to the duty-free shop. They have to pay to bring their goods into the U.S., okay? The federal government collects that tariff. It's not all that much money, okay? Like there's, the federal government, just keep in mind, it's like, this is a time that the federal government is not collecting really anything in terms of taxes. There's no income tax. There's very little revenue coming in. This is the same federal government that has to fund and support a war machine that is sufficient to beat the southern states. Like, warfare is oftentimes primarily an economic activity, like bringing your economic power to bear militarily. And there's a lot of questions about how the federal government is going to do this, okay? Meaning that there are a number of monetary and economic inventions from the time of the Civil War. It's like it's the first time that a bunch of stuff happens economically in the United States. There's the first use of fiat currency, okay, something that you're discussing more in the context of like MMT, that is, the government issues the currency, okay? This is the first time that the U.S. uses a paper money system in which the paper money is not backed by gold. That is, it's just paper. You can't take it to the Treasury Department and say, I want this back in gold. It can't be redeemed. It can't be exchanged. It's just a piece of paper, okay? These are called greenbacks because they're green, okay? So it's the first time that the U.S. uses fiat currency. This is the debate. Remember when Chris was talking about legal tender when he held up the bill? It's like, oh, it says legal tender for all debts private and public in the United States. That's authorized by the Congress. The Congress says, okay, the Treasury can print these greenbacks. The greenbacks are legal tender. That is, people are required to accept them. You can't say like, that's your paper money. I don't care. Like, I only deal in gold. Legally, you can't do that. Okay, that's why it's called legal tender. The Congress institutes the first income tax. The first time that significant taxes are collected by the federal government in the United States. Because the Civil War is extremely expensive. Extremely expensive. It's like hard to conceive just how expensive it was. The first loan that the federal government raised to try and support the Northern Army, okay, these like bankers, the federal government, the Treasury Secretary, they got together a bunch of Northern bankers in New York City. They're like, we need a bunch of money to make sure that we can win the war. The bankers come up with, I can't remember the exact sum. It's like, I think it's $20 or $30 million in US dollars at the time. A lot of money that they're like, obviously this will be enough for you to win the war. The federal government ends up spending that amount of money 60 times over during the course of the next 5 years. Okay, so we're talking about just like organizing economic activity on a scale that had not been seen thus far in terms of the government's power in the United States. It fundamentally changes everything. The political actors who are organizing this economic activity is the newly founded Republican Party. Okay, it's like the Republicans, Lincoln is their second presidential candidate. Okay? If you think about the sectional conflict that we were just talking about, it's like, oh, the North and the South have these very different economic interests. Okay? Part of the reason that the Civil War, the Civil War These are people who, decide eventually that it's worth fighting a war. Congress in the 1850s, it's like there are some people who get beat up like senators get beat up on the floor of Congress. Okay, like somebody clubs another senator over the head. Like times are tense. Okay, when you're getting towards a civil war, that's the kind of stuff that happens. Okay, so imagine now you're the Republican Party. You control the Congress and the presidency, and by the way, your primary political and economic opponents are all no longer in government. They're all gone. Okay, like imagine if we woke up tomorrow and it's just like, well, one party isn't represented in the Congress or the government anymore because they all formed a different country. Like either party, if they were in control, you can imagine they would do things a little differently than they have to right now, fighting one another for political control. So the Republican Party is in this unique circumstance where they can push through a lot of pet economic ideas that the South would have blocked and did block for a very, very long time. I didn't go into any like national banking stuff or any of that. That you could read about some of those earlier conflicts, whatever. Some major pieces of Republican legislation that are important to think about economically. The Homestead Act. The federal government grants title to anybody who, it's like, this is basically in what is referred to as the Old Northwest, what we would think of as the Midwest. Okay? This is the beginning of settlement of the Midwest. There are also a number of ongoing Indian wars that are occurring at this time. Like a number of people who eventually fight in the Civil War, they either are veterans because they were originally fighting in Indian wars in the Old Northwest, or they go on to fight wars on the Great Plains versus the tribes that resist colonization. But the Homestead Act says, if you move out and you improve the land, you build a home, you improve the land, you get to keep it. This is a redistributive economic policy in the extreme. Like, you're talking about a huge wave of immigration from Europe where people have never owned land, and the government says, if you move out to the countryside and you start farming the land and you can hack it, you get to keep it. The Morrill Act, Morrill's actually a senator from Vermont, okay, establishes the land grant universities. Basically, any state university or school that you've seen that's very large, it's almost certainly a land grant university. That is, the federal government grants those universities the land and supports their operations. The Transcontinental Railroad. Lincoln was a lawyer. He worked during part of his time, he worked as a railroad lawyer. Like, the railroads are the major capital, canals and then railroads are the major capital investments in the United States during the run-up to and following the Civil War. Okay? Prior to the Transcontinental Railroad, I want you to think about this. It's like there's a couple ways for you to reach San Francisco from New York. You can get on a ship and sail all the way around South America. You can get on a stagecoach and proceed by horse to San Francisco. That takes a long, long time, right? Okay? On the railroad, it's like it cuts it down to under a week. You can imagine, it's like getting to ride a railroad across the country after you've been having to sail around South America. It's a pretty big economic difference, okay? Railroads are a transformative capital investment because they mean that goods can move across U.S. internal markets. That is, suddenly, like, think about all those people, because of the Homestead Act, there are a lot of people now living out what previously was the Great Plains, what would have been regarded as the middle of nowhere. Okay, that is not accurate from the perspective of the people whose land was taken to establish the Homestead Act, but okay, you just imagine, like, your family decides to move out onto the frontier. You're like, goodbye to everybody that we've ever known. We're never going to see you again. It would take way too long to ever come back here. Sorry, bye. Okay? Instead, you now live in a place that is served by a railroad. You load your goods, your farm goods, onto the railroad. And the railroad brings back manufactured goods that you can't make on the plains. How many of you are from either Kansas or Nebraska? Raise your hand. God, what? This is, I'm stunned. I hadn't even kept track of that when doing the application. Okay, Asia. How much timber is there available in Kansas?
My little research group discussed that today.
Yeah.
No trees.
No trees, okay? What does that mean? That means you can't make any furniture. It is extremely difficult to build houses out of anything other, like when you've looked at those little pioneer stories about like, oh, they had a sod house. It's like, yeah, because there's no wood. There's nothing to build. It's just like you got grass, that's it, okay? The internal markets created by the railroad, right, now means that people who are manufacturing goods in the United States can ship them to people living in the plains. Farmers on the plains, they send food to the cities manufacture goods, they send it back in the other direction on the railroad. This is the only way to economically run a railroad because you have to have goods moving in both directions to make it profitable. Otherwise your railroad loses money every time, okay? So this version of the Republican Party is extremely invested in internal improvements in the United States. It is pro-business, it is influenced by finance, but also has this kind of like populist element of giving away lots of free land, making sure that people who live on that land have access to the other internal markets in the United States. The Republican Party, because it is so new and because it's essentially the only, like during the Civil War, the North it's not a one-party state. There are Northern Democrats who stay loyal, but like the Republicans run things, okay? They run the country. And they are split. Like there's some kind of strange combinations in the Republican Party. A fracture between the radical Republicans, many of whom are from New England, and those that are more closely aligned with finance and big business. Lots of them tied to railroad corporations, some of the first major corporations in the United States. During Reconstruction, so the war is won, okay? Let's think a little bit about the post-Civil War landscape in the United States. The North has engaged in a very significant form of economic warfare versus the South during the war. All of the southern railroads have been torn up. Atlanta and several other major southern cities have basically burned. There's not a lot. There wasn't a ton to begin with in terms, it's a largely agricultural portion of the country, and what little capital investment there was in the South was largely destroyed by the war. This is a potential opportunity for people represented by this wing of the party, as in there will be capital investments that need to be made in the South. We're going to have to rebuild. Okay, well, we can do some of that. The radical faction of the party sees Reconstruction as an opportunity to fundamentally change the character of the South. They are generally, they are abolitionists. They are convinced that the slave owners have created this, horrible event of the Civil War. They blame it on the slave owners. Probably not inaccurately. And they are ready to transform the South both economically and politically. They want to seize the property of people who rebelled against the federal government and redistribute it. Notice, I'm trying to throw in the word redistribution a few times here to keep in mind that all we are talking about are these different patterns of economic distribution in the economic history of the U.S. And it is very significant here that the seizure of property, that is the plantations, okay, you seize that property and you break it up and you give it to freed people, freed former black slaves. Black former slaves, excuse me. Okay? This is the 40 acres and a mule tagline for Reconstruction and the Freedmen's Bureau. This is also the beginning of the U.S. Justice Department that is originally formed in large part to try and quell the KKK. Probably the history of the Civil War has not been explained to you as Reconstruction is basically an early form of counterinsurgency. It is more accurate to think of Reconstruction as something like post-war Iraq than it is to think of it as walking around and just oh, I'm in Atlanta, okay? It's not like the Civil War ends technically. That does not mean that everyone's we surrendered, oops, our bad. That's not the way this works. These two factions in the Republican Party have very different economic visions, as I said. This one is a radical redistributive plan that would also solidify the base of the Republican Party in the South. So this is also an element to say, well, now black people can vote in the South, and they're going to vote Republican. If you all had been, like, I'm old, so I was around for the, quote, Republican Revolution when the Republican Party retook the U.S. House for the first time since the 20s in 1994. Okay? 1994, Newt Gingrich comes to Congress. The Republican Revolution is what they called it. It's like the Republican Party was back in the House. Okay? There were all these like news headlines or banners at the time where it's like, so-and-so is the first Republican elected to, be a senator from Alabama since, and then they would name a date from Reconstruction. Because those Republicans were either white radical Republicans or black Republicans. They attempted to form reconstructive governments that would solidify the base of the Republican Party, that would engage in a more radical economic program. This vision loses out. The radical Republicans lose the political economic fight about the future of the U.S. economy and the future of former slaves. In part because Reconstruction, since it is counterinsurgency, is extremely expensive. It's very difficult. There are lots of people who, there are plenty of racist people who don't live in the South who are not interested in the economic well-being of former slaves. Okay? The big business part of the Republican Party is interested in a few things. One, restoring the gold standard. They hate this. This greenbacks thing, no. Okay? If you control capital, if you have money, if you're a creditor, you're a banker, you're a financier, that's your economic position depends upon the fact that capital and finances are scarce. You want credit to be tight, not loose. You want it to be, you want it to be the case that you're the one giving out the loan at a higher rate of interest. It's better for you, generally. If you already have a lot of money, okay, you want the ability to get money to be relatively scarce, or that's your bare economic interest from this perspective, okay? So, you want gold convertibility, not paper money. The government can just print paper money. The government can't make gold. You can only find it. This set of people still wants a high tariff. Okay, because now a lot of these manufactured goods are being sold in an internal market in the United States, which is very large. There are a lot of people in the United States and even more people arriving in the United States. They don't need to sell goods internationally nearly as much. They do not support free trade. They want a high tariff. The tariff is a foundational economic battle from the Civil War until the New Deal. This is an economic policy that most of us we don't care about, we don't think about tariffs all that much. This is there are knockdown, drag-out fights in Congress and the congressional committee chairs who control the setting of tariff rates because all of the economic interests and conflicts in the United States are in some ways played out via debates about the tariff. Somebody had their hand raised, Ryan?
Sorry, so the radical Republicans, if they were against this sort of sharecropping system, this the export basically, the export economy, then why were they opposed to putting back a high tariff?
Because this set of people the radical Republicans are not opposed to a high tariff. That's shared across these. It's just the reasons for this are connected to scarce capital and credit. Does that make sense? Yeah. I didn't mean, this is not something they disagree about. This is a consistent part of Republican policy. Okay. This also means that after the Civil War, the U.S. lives in a deflationary era for several decades. Especially following the Panic of 1873. Think of it as the version of it's not like the Great Depression because nothing's like the Great Depression, but it is the 19th century U.S. equivalent of the Great Depression or the Great Recession.
What was the year?
1873, the Panic of 1873, okay? Characteristic of a deflationary era, that is, instead of inflation, right? We talked about inflation, that is, your money becomes less valuable. It buys fewer things because there's more money chasing after fewer goods. Deflation is the opposite. If you have a deflationary expectation, you expect your money, you want to hold on to your, well, if you have money, you want to hold on to it because you believe that it will purchase more in the future, not less. You have never really lived through any period of very significant deflation. Even having lived through some like recessionary events, you've not lived through decades of deflation. You've lived in a low inflation environment, but never deflation or consistent deflation. This is over several decades. Agricultural producers in the US are in significant debt. Currency is scarce because capital is scarce, because the US has gone back on the gold standard, no more paper money. This economy is characterized by huge boom and bust cycles, thus the Panic of 1873, along with, there's like, if you look at these economic graphs from the 19th century, it's like, it just goes up and down pretty consistently. As a result, there are populist pressures, okay, to respond to the economic plight, particularly of agricultural producers. These are largely represented by the Democratic Party, since the Republican Party has aligned itself largely with the interests of big business. The Democratic Party is extremely strong in the South. Not surprising, okay? It's like Democrats who lost the war, but then gained, it's like the fight over Reconstruction that the Republicans essentially lose, the radical Republicans lose, okay? The, quote, redeemer governments are brought back in. They are largely run by white Southern Democrats. Okay? This is reversed from our current party alignment. So if you're having trouble thinking about it, just be like, where I would expect Democrats and Republicans to be, swap it. Okay? That also means that the Midwest, the agricultural producing states, are heavily Democratic. Or at least that is a place that the Democratic Party has some successes. New England is extremely Republican. The Northeast is extremely Republican. One of the major demands of this set of agricultural populists, because they're all in debt, currency is scarce, it is difficult for them to get loans. Most farmers in the United States operate on credit. You have to buy the next year's seeds, plant them, then you don't get paid until you sell those goods. Do we see why? It's like, that means that for a large portion of the year, you are in debt. And it also means that if your crops sell for less than you expected, you are going to go further into debt. Like, the price of agricultural goods determines your future. The other thing that happens here is like, none of the production of any of these agricultural goods is regulated. So it could be that like, well, it's a really big year for corn for everybody. There's tons of corn. Well, that also means that if there's an abundance of supply, it might get lower prices for it, right? Might go further into debt. Your farm might get wiped out in a flood. There's no flood insurance. There is no federal program for supporting you or managing your economic consequences. Being an agricultural producer in the United States in the 19th century is to be extremely exposed to risk and to generally be in debt. So, in order to fix this problem, it's like, you've probably heard people get politically very angry at bankers and finance in our current environment. Okay, that's the end of the 19th century. You have a lot of populist pressures that blame New England and Northeastern finance and banking. New York is the financial center of the United States, going way back. They're very angry. One of their demands is for a bimetallic currency standard. That is, currency should be backed not just by gold, but also by silver. The US, for a while, issues silver certificates. Some of them actually still circulate, though very, very, very few. Okay? if you think about the gold standard world of currency is difficult for us to understand at times. It's like you could take in banknotes and redeem them for gold. Like physical gold. That's what it means to be backed by gold, a gold standard. The currency is valued at a certain level of gold. Remember, this means that the currency supply for the United States and the world at the time, for most advanced economies, is limited by what?
How much gold you can mine up.
How much gold there is. Is it easy to predict how much gold there will be?
No.
No, it is not. Okay? If you've ever read about the California Gold Rush or the Klondike Gold Rush or the Silver Rush in Montana, okay? This is because finding gold or silver at this time is literally digging money out of the ground. But it also means that the monetary policy of the United States is constrained by what gets dug out of the ground. That is a very difficult way to run an economy. It is not very predictable. It tends to feed a number of these boom and bust cycles because it means that the inflation or valuation and devaluation of the currency depends on how much gold they're digging out of the ground. What? Somebody had their hand raised.
You said that in this instance, like deflation was caused by a change in currency. Are there other like ways, like in other instances, what is deflation caused by? Like, is it caused by decreasing efficiency or?
It is so inflation, right? Too much money chasing too few goods is one way of like. I'm given a particular picture of inflation here. There's some disagreements about what causes inflation, etc. This is that whole economic theories thing. I'm giving you the shorthand for a kind of just thinking about it as money has less purchasing power. You're getting less for what you want. Okay, deflate, and that's, if you think about it, that's people having money but demanding stuff that is scarce. Flip it around, you get deflation. People don't have money is scarce. Goods may be abundant. The goods don't even have to be abundant. It could just be that the money is very scarce. So the purchasing power of that money is very strong.
So in that way, deflation is worse than inflation?
Many people believe yes. So like this is part of an economic debate is should we be more afraid of inflation or deflation? So like you will read in some of the policy proposals that you talk about, some people would consider themselves inflation hawks. That is, they are concerned about inflation because they believe it tends to spiral. Okay? Inflation doves are generally more concerned about deflation. That is the failure of demand. Okay? Remember, Chris mentioned aggregate demand, right? Anybody remember what aggregate demand is? Yeah.
Isn't it the amount of demand over a whole economy, including all sectors?
Absolutely, right? So demand for all goods and services across the economy, aggregate demand, okay? If aggregate demand is low, okay, if aggregate demand is low, that is more likely to coincide with deflation in a deflationary environment because there is not that much money chasing the goods that exist, okay? So deflation tends to be associated with times of reduced economic activity. We will discuss another deflationary period coming up here in a little bit. Okay, but yes, does that clarify? Okay, so like that's why currency is scarce. Thus, that is one of the aspects generating deflation. Okay, yeah.
Generally, like, how long did these deflationary periods last, and what were like the methods used to resolve them?
Okay, well, this is part of the dilemma here is that I wrote era up here because this is most of the late 19th century in the United States. It's a consistent period of deflation. That's part of what it's like. This is a part, like probably if you have taken a U.S. history class, this is almost certainly the part of U.S. history that you like kind of skipped over. Yeah? So like the 19th century, you're like, yeah, Grover Cleveland, like he's that president who was elected like non-consecutively. Yeah, that guy. Okay? And then you're like, and then there's World War I. Am I getting it about right? Okay. Part of the reason that we're telling this story a little bit differently is to try and draw some of these economic threads that like economically this is an extremely important and unusual period. But it's like you don't learn a lot of economic history. In part because teaching economic history is teaching conflict. And people like to teach you resolution more than they like teaching you conflict, right? Your typical US history book in high school kind of is this like March of Progress style narrative where it's like there are all these conflicts, but they get resolved, and like we're the U.S. and it's great. Okay, I mean, am I wrong? Like, have you all read a history book that is basically like that? Okay, so like that's not the kind of book that you would read if you read that book. Okay, somebody else had their hand raised.
Yes, the deflationary period, if there was like extreme boom and bust cycles, they were trying to stabilize the economy. Would that explain why there was a lot of imperial expansion? Because they wanted more resources because of the boom cycle or bust cycle, or was it just because they were feeling imperialist?
I haven't prepped the full. Like I said, this is U.S. focused rather than international, and there's also a good K that could be read here of my notion of U.S. as domestic rather than the U.S. as an empire continually throughout this period. One thing that you could say is a lot of the Republicans who were significant supporters of imperial policy in the United States and acquisition. So like McKinley and the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. incorporates the Philippines, Puerto Rico, etc. Okay, that those choices are generally made by Republicans of that era. Okay, and it does fit also with this like big business finance thing in the sense that like when Hawaii is conquered and incorporated into the U.S. Okay, it's turned into a giant plantation, largely fruit. The plantation model carries over into other aspects without slave labor, but still with many of the similar kind of like the way that that form of economic production is designed. Does that help a little bit? It is good to remind that this is an era that is also about, I've skipped over the Mexican War to get to the Civil War. I have not done much about westward expansion and conquest. There's only so much time. Sorry. Okay. Are we okay on this like debate? Like, think about it. In the late 19th century, there's a serious debate going on among presidential candidates about what U.S. money should look like. We don't have an easy equivalent of that. If you've ever read about the William Jennings Bryan Cross of Gold speech, does anybody know about the Cross of Gold? What's the Cross of Gold? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was like the speech he gave at the 1896 Democratic Convention.
Yep.
Which was like super big, and it inspired people to nominate him. And he ended it with the line, "Do not classify mankind upon a cross of gold," when he was supporting like Bimetallic Currency, and so that got him the nomination.
Think about that rhetoric. Don't crucify us upon a cross of gold. It's like that. That's a literal economic and political argument about having the U.S. adhere to the gold standard punishes farmers. Like, we don't hear that oratory as like, oh, this is a big, dramatic political and economic conflict, but it is. Okay? Okay. Here we go. So now you know a little bit about the end of the 19th century, unlike every other American history class that you've ever taken. Okay? Don't forget it. Try and hold on to it a little bit. Now we're making the classic move to skip ahead to World War I. Okay? Wilson is a Democrat. He wins election in 1912. He is the first. I mentioned Grover Cleveland, that guy where it's like you just know him because he's the non-consecutive president. He was a gold Democrat. So it's like he was a pro-gold standard Democrat. He was a somewhat unusual figure. The reason that he got elected as a Democrat nationally is that one of the reasons is that he was a strong supporter of gold. So it's like some of the economic populist arguments that could be made against the other Democrats couldn't be made against Cleveland. Okay? The Democrats, up until this time, have been largely a sectional party. That is, they've been concentrated heavily in the South. They've made some progress in terms of the plains and the Midwest. The major reason for this is the party that lost in the Civil War. They're concentrated in the South, but they generally are not considered to be like as a national political figure, they are significantly less respected. It's very difficult for a Democrat to get elected, elected to the presidency. So Wilson is the first one in a while. Okay? Agricultural interests support this iteration of the Democratic Party, and also large waves of immigrants. You ever heard anything about Tammany Hall and the kind of democratic machine operating in a number of large cities in the East? Okay? That's this era. The Democrats unite the interests of new immigrant, largely poor laborers, agricultural producers, and their intellectual kind of lodestar is identified as progressivism. Like that's the name that we have for it now. And Wilson is a progressive, though also a Southerner, and thus pretty strongly committed to a white supremacist version of what progressivism looks like. But the progressives, they win in large part because the Republican Party splits. Teddy Roosevelt gets very angry with his protege Taft. Teddy Roosevelt runs as a third-party candidate, the Bull Moose Party. It splits the Republican vote. Wilson gets elected. So like this is a kind of odd circumstance. This is not unexpected. The progressives get their chance to implement a policy, set of economic policies that are more heavily invested in the government regulation of capital. All this big business stuff is like the Republicans have been the party that is generally pro-capital. They're aligned with capital interests, holders of wealth. Some of the significant economic policies that the progressives are committed to: an end to child labor. I guess I should make it clear that that's anti-child labor, not pro-child labor. Okay. A maximum amount of, like a maximum set of hours in the work week. The introduction and constitutionalization of the income tax. Because if they believe in a stronger government, a stronger federal government, they also then think that that government means resources, thus taxation. In that tax and transfer part of the topic, this is where we get some of the initial moves to have significant taxation support a stronger and more robust federal government. Okay? This is also, we're getting towards the, like, this is the end of the Gilded Age. Okay, like that's late 19th century, is the Gilded Age. A bunch of the inequality stats that you will see in the like impact cards that you'll read about inequality, they're going to start making economic comparisons to early 20th century, the early 20th century United States. First, that's because that's when a bunch of economic data actually starts being collected. Okay, so like a larger government that is attempting to regulate economic practices collects economic data. Previously, it's like economic historians have to dig through just like, records that it's like they spend decades trying to accumulate and understand what the hell is going on. Finally, here we got a government that produces some of this data on its own. It's like the initial collection of economic statistics. That's part of the reason that when you see these economic graphs about inequality, that they start in the early 20th century, because that's when the data starts. It is also one of the high points of inequality in the United States. The reason it's called the Gilded Age, that's a Mark Twain coinage if I remember correctly, okay, is like gilded means covered in gold or covered in some other metal, so it's like, it's intended to be like, it's a critique of, these people are ostentatious. They're like taking everything and covering it with gold, okay? They kind of like, think of this as the like, it's a little bit like the Trump is a Bulgarian kind of thing, right? It's like, I gotta have my name up there and it's gold, like okay, like that's what Gilded Age is intended to convey, is that this extreme era of inequality is like, there are a bunch of really, really, really rich people, okay, who have concentrated significant fortunes in the United States. Does anybody know the source of those significant fortunes? So like when we say the interests of capital, what are the major forms of capital at the time at the end of the 19th century? Oil, so that's, oh God, which one? That's Rockefeller. Rockefeller is oil. Steel is Carnegie.
Textiles.
Railroads is really the third one that I'm looking for here, which is Vanderbilt. Okay, so like if all the biggest, the biggest mansions that have ever been built in the United States that are now like National Historic Landmarks or whatever, they're all built by these people. You can go see the Vanderbilt Mansion. You can go see like any Carnegie Library. That's Carnegie had enough money to just like, we're going to create a network of libraries across the United States. It's all out of my mind. Okay, that's the Gilded Age and the kind of era of extreme inequality. So the progressives perceive themselves as attacking this, system of extreme wealth inequality, acting more in the interests of labor. Don't put kids to work. You can only work a certain number of hours. They can't make you, like, you can't sign a contract that has you working 95 hours a week. Like, it turns out that's very bad for you and your family, right? And we're going to tax the income of some of these very, very wealthy people to help fund some of these other measures to control economic inequality. Early in Wilson's term, we also witnessed the creation of the Federal Reserve. This is the first time that the US has a unified single currency in its existence. All of these people over here, when we're dealing with debates over should it be backed by gold or silver, there's no more greenbacks, so there is no more like federal paper currency. There's coins that get minted by the federal government, but any paper notes, so like bills, which I realize now is something that you all don't use all that often, but you know, like people, older people like me, right? Like I still think of money as just it's the paper and whatever, okay? That all of these people, these banknotes, even though they are backed by gold or potentially backed by silver, they are largely issued by state banks and then some by national banks. So bank notes circulate in different portions of the country at different values. This is a very weird world for us to think of. Okay? It's like, I have a bill that I'm holding. It draws on the gold deposits of a bank in New York. I hand it to you in Illinois, and you're like, I don't know if this is real. That's not worth as much as you say it is. I'll take it at a 10% discount. That's a $100 banknote. I'll give you $90 worth of goods for it. Pretty weird. Okay? It's not legal tender. It's just the tender created by a bank. The bank is a collection of gold held in a vault. The bank issues its notes, and hopefully it doesn't have a run and go bankrupt. Bank failures are a constant feature of this era. There are a large number of banks in New York, but if I remember the stat off the top of my head, out of something like the 2,500 banks in the United States at the time, over 1/4 of them defaults at some point. So just imagine if you're like sitting, you know, with your family or with your friends, and it's like, oh yeah, 25% of us have had our bank account just at some point, large portions of the money that our family had just disappeared. Sorry. Too bad. You can understand why this might lead to the creation of a single currency that is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. World War I is a transformative economic event. If you thought the Civil War was expensive, that 60x figure that I gave you, World War I is beyond human imagination up until this point. Germany, France, Britain, Russia, Austria, all of the most advanced economies in the world dedicate themselves to producing as much metal, explosives, chemical gas, etc., as they possibly can to lob at each other over roughly the same 100 miles of territory for like 5 years. It is extremely expensive. Nothing like it has occurred in any of these economies before. It is an industrial form of warfare that they are not prepared to support. In order to do so, they have to borrow a lot of money. They borrow it largely from the United States. That is the French and the British, not so much the Germans. Britain and France, and borrowing money, like borrowing at this point is, we are sending our gold across the Atlantic. You are sending back all of this stuff that we are using to fight the war. The war ends with the New York Federal Reserve controlling a very large amount of the gold reserves of the world. The US has moved from being a peripheral economy. Remember, it started all the way back in our colonial history as it's on the periphery, it's being run by another country, to the core. It is now the source of global credit, or one of the major sources of global credit. there is lots of gold available to lend in the United States. You know that phrase, the roaring 20s? Okay. That's like, and it's referring to an economic boom. After the war, the U.S. is a strong economy. It has ample sources of credit, significant investments. This is also the time of the rise in speculative investment, particularly in the stock market, in equities. Because there's a lot of money to go around. The Republicans are back. Sorry. Everybody woke up. That's good. The Republicans are back in charge. The Republicans are back in charge. They support the interests of finance, banking. They run the economy. Well, this 1920s boom ends in the ultimate bust. For a lot of complicated international financial reasons, along with other stuff that I would love to explain but cannot. Maybe it'll be an elective, I don't know. International credit collapses. The economies go off the gold standard. And the world sees a change in economic activity unlike anything else in its history. So here we are bumping along in the 19th century. This is the unemployment rate in the United States. Here's April 2020. You all may remember it. There's 1932. So the Depression starts in 29, Black Monday. Black Friday. One of the 80s and the 30s, one of them's Friday, one of them's Monday. Okay. But you see how it's like, this is the depths of COVID. Economic activity has ground to a halt. If you remember what April 2020 was like, it's like, you were probably sitting at home playing Among Us. Sus, right? Very sus. Almost twice the rate of unemployment. It is hard for us to conceive of what a dramatic event the Great Depression was for those experiencing it. It's like if you imagine nearly 30% of people being out of work, like you've seen a crazy economic event in your lifetime, and it's twice the impact for much, much longer. So it's like that's one of these things, just like referencing it has to settle in as, of course it transforms the politics of the country. Because this set of people who have been largely in charge of the politics and economics of the United States are basically completely discredited. You can look at the electoral map for FDR's first election. I think he wins all but 2 states, 1, something like that. It's crazy, okay? Like, the Democrats now run the show in a way that is totally different from anything that has come before. It nationalizes the Democratic Party. They move from a sectional party representing a very specific set of economic interests to being the national party of labor and agriculture against finance. Unsurprisingly, out of this event comes an impulse to control the role of finance in the economy. The Glass-Steagall Act separates investment from commercial banking. Banks are not allowed to speculate with the reserves that are provided by their depositors, roughly. There are strict controls on the size of banks and strict controls for the first time on their reserves and capital requirements. Not for the first time, sorry. There are now capital requirements that are very different. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, begins to operate to regulate the stock market for the first time, to bring transparency to, like, any prospectus or anything that you've read about any stock ever, that doesn't really happen before the SEC or is not verified before the SEC. There are bans on marginal buying on the margin of stocks, and the government begins to directly create employment via a series of programs that are a part of the New Deal. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. The government provides millions of jobs to the unemployed to make things, to build things. Like you can go on the web, there's like sites that keep track of all the buildings in any given area that are still WPA made buildings. Like there's a good chance that the post office in your town was built by the WPA. There's a good chance if you visit a national park that you've walked across a bridge or hiked on a trail that was made by the WPA or the CCC, right? This is a transformative economic legacy. You can still see the effects of this set of policies that the government employed people to produce things they were previously regarded as solely the sector of private economic activity. During this time, the Democrats, as part of the New Deal, changed fundamentally labor, the position of labor in relationship to the government. All throughout the early 20th century and late 19th century, the federal government acts as a strike breaker. It generally supports the interests of finance, which means, for instance, that when railroad workers or steel workers strike, the federal government is in part responsible for ensuring that those people go back to work. And by go back to work, I mean some of them end up dying sometimes when there are armed confrontations between strikers, their company, and the government. Another thing that is a little difficult for us to imagine in the concrete way in which it happens here. The National Labor Relations Board is founded by the Wagner Act. The federal government begins to enforce fair collective bargaining. That is, it recognizes the rights of the unions to collectively bargain in major industries. So you're not bargaining as an individual worker signing a contract, you are bargaining as a collective, as in all of us will not show up to this auto manufacturing plant unless you pay all of us the following wage. Social Security is enacted in order to cure very, very high levels of poverty among the elderly. Like if you think about, there's previously no social insurance for the elderly, and so if all of the people who are working in the families are unemployed and none of the people who are older have jobs and are counting on the other members of their household to support them, there's of course an extreme increase in poverty among the old. That's part of the reason that Social Security targets the elderly. Rates of poverty among the elderly during this time are very, very high. This is also a period of ecological crisis and overproduction. There is a crisis of demand as well. The ecological component to this, the overproduction, is the Dust Bowl. When you're a farmer over here who's heavily indebted, you tend to believe that your only way of securing your future is to produce as much as possible. Producing as much as possible means treating the land very badly. You try and get as much out of it as you possibly can. And then something like 6 to 7 feet worth of US topsoil blows away in 2 years. So this isn't just an economic phenomenon, it is also an environmental one. We don't think of the New Deal as originally a Green New Deal, but a number of the agricultural services and extension services that are provided for the first time by the USDA are scientific ways of responding to ecological crisis. As in, you should not farm this land as intensively as you possibly can. And we will regulate overproduction. There's a period during the New Deal where large amounts of agricultural products, because there's such a glut of supply, are destroyed by the government. There's so much milk, we're going to dump hundreds of thousands of gallons of it out because it cannot fetch any money. That's what a crisis of demand means. There's all kinds of goods, but no one has the ability to buy them. Thus, the aggregate demand thing that we were discussing earlier, the Great Depression is a crisis in aggregate demand. The New Deal has a number of important racial limits. So I don't remember who it was. Who talked about redlining during Chris's topic lecture? Okay, Christian, nice work. Okay, that's an example of the racial limit of the New Deal. In part because the New Deal is created by a Democratic Party that has been nationalized but is previously governed by the sectional interests of the South. So all of those Southern Democratic senators and House representatives, many of them place significant barriers on the extent to which New Deal programs can benefit racial minorities, black people in particular. This is not to say that the New Deal did not have positive effects in terms of the racial distribution of wealth and opportunity in this country. It did. Many of the criticisms and back and forth that you might read in various elements of the capitalism K, the racial capitalism K that Asia was working on in her generic, they may reference the relevant economic statistics about the racial limits of the New Deal and whether or not that means that a Green New Deal or some version of that in the future could potentially correct for or take into account a number of these racial disparities that are found in the original New Deal. World War II largely ends the Great Depression because if you're going to fight a war against the Nazis, you have to build a lot of stuff. There's a lot of demand. You got to build tanks, got to build planes. The U.S. moves from a country that is capable of manufacturing like a couple hundred planes a year to 100,000 planes. Think about the degree of investment, capital investment, that is required to make that happen. Huge automobile plants and aircraft manufacturing plants begin to appear. The federal government coordinates most of that economic activity because it is for wartime. The wartime administration coordinates production in the United States to a degree that is unseen prior to that. The bit of international stuff here is that the U.S., this era of control that is referenced in the Levy book, okay, goes international. Post-1945, the U.S. is by far the largest economy in the world. It is undamaged by the war. Most of Europe, it's like most of the major cities in Europe during World War II have been bombed. Like, if you look at pictures from World War II of any of these European cities at the end of the war, they are piles of rubble. If you look at, it's like, imagine pictures from Ukraine, all of Europe. This is a very difficult economic time for most of Europe. The U.S. is undamaged in terms of its own domestic economy. It is already a very significant creditor because of the effects of World War I. It sets the terms for the financial and economic settlement after World War II. This is the beginning of a U.S.-led world order. Any of the debates that you have ever had about hegemony, they start here. Bretton Woods is the name for the agreement / set of institutions that are economically focused that are created by the end of World War II, largely at the behest of the United States. Bretton Woods is a resort at the bottom of Mount Washington that we could drive to from here, out in the middle of nowhere in New Hampshire. The Bretton Woods Agreement institutes a dollar-based international system with capital controls. That is, capital can only move so quickly across national borders. Speculative investment is generally discouraged. One way of thinking about this is that the U.S. believes that in large part what ought to happen, in part aided by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, is that by deploying its resources of credit and controlling the flows of capital, remember, these are all Democrats who are influenced by the Great Depression boom and bust, this graph over here, right? They generally don't support the interests of speculative finance capital. They want it to be controlled. They want to develop other economies to look like the national economy of the United States. Development assistance begins at this time. The U.S. theorizes, economic policymakers in the U.S. theorize that other economies ought to be modernized along the lines of the United States. In a dollar-based system, instead of being backed by gold, other currencies are convertible. They are pegged to the dollar, not to gold. There's a little hitch here, though. The dollar is pegged to gold. It's a little like the gold standard with more steps. Okay? This will create a problem here in not too long. But for the moment, at the end of World War II, this system is reasonably stable. There's some historical debate about that. It is needlessly detailed even for this nerdy lecture. The economic paradigm at this time is heavily influenced by John Maynard Keynes and Keynesianism. That is, national governments should pursue full employment so that that never happens again, right? Like, just think about your US policymaker sitting there in 1950. You and basically every one of your constituents has lived through this. You never, ever, ever want it to happen ever again. So, one of the things that you believe is we need to make sure that people are employed and that they demand goods, so we never suffer from a Great Depression style collapse in aggregate demand ever again. There should be a social safety net that also encourages or stabilizes economic activity so that it is not so boom and bust. Those New Deal institutions, right, can be extended to support the economic welfare and general economic equality within the United States. We're going to skip ahead a little bit here to the 60s and 70s. Oh, sorry. No, I did. Like, I mentioned Social Security there very briefly, but just like these New Deal social safety net, social insurance style institutions, they are the literal precursors of the topic, right? In the sense that we're talking about expanding Social Security. And then in amendments to Social Security, in the 60s, Lyndon Johnson, in the economic policies of the Great Society and the War on Poverty, introduces a number of programs that are intended to wield community power for economic development in the United States, and that will extend the social safety net in the form of Medicare and Medicaid, programs that we've already discussed in the other topic lectures. From this perspective, we can see the civil rights struggle as also an economic struggle. Chances are that this is another element that your U.S. history textbook avoids. You might see a reference to the Poor People's Campaign. You might read that, MLK eventually opposed the war in Vietnam. You probably would not read that Coretta Scott King supported an overall economic plan for the United States that included a federal job guarantee. Many of the radical economic thinkers who are important leaders in the civil rights movement, they aren't thinking of this purely in terms of the politics of the right, securing, the right to vote. They think of that as both a political and an economic struggle. Not surprisingly, they support a robust federal government, not only to secure things politically like the right to vote, but also economically to change the opportunity structure in the U.S. economy. They perceive correctly that they have been largely left out of some aspects of the New Deal. They want to extend this thinking beyond its limits. Job guarantee, the original proposals for the job guarantee are a part of that. Johnson's Great Society, one of the features, and this is where I'm starting to paint very broad brushstrokes since we're trying to wrap up here so that you can actually have lab today. Okay? Vietnam both politically splits the Democratic Party because there are pro-war Democrats and extremely anti-war Democrats. They disagree so vehemently about the war that it's like the party cannot agree. If you've ever seen the Chicago '68 footage, okay, that's this. That's here. When you have the police force run by the most prominent Democratic mayor in the country beating up the activists coming to the Democratic National Convention over issues regarding Vietnam, you know the party has some trouble. Vietnam is also extremely expensive. For budgetary gimmicky purposes, this is when LBJ moves Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored entities responsible for issuing mortgages in the United States, back to the redlining discussion, okay, the trying to support home ownership in the United States. They move those off the government books in a budgetary move to make it look like the US budget is in better shape. this creates some problems later on. Nixon, representing what he terms the silent majority, wins in 68, is also reelected in 72, in part on the basis of the Southern strategy. That is, for the first time, the Republicans will attempt to win Southern states in a national election. This is one of those mind-bending moments where you're like, wait a minute, what? They're already winning all of those states. They are not. Okay? Realignment between the Democratic and Republican parties begins largely over the issue of civil rights. LBJ in signing the Civil Rights Act is like, we've lost the South for a generation. Turns out, maybe a few. The 70s brings about an era typically termed stagflation. That is contrary to the theory of full employment, in which as long as there is sufficient demand, you can stabilize the operation of the economy. Remember the dual mandate that Chris mentioned in his other topic lecture? What's the dual mandate that the Fed has?
Keep inflation under control, but also try to minimize unemployment.
Price stability along with full employment. Suddenly, stagflation, against the precepts of these economists, you have a combination of low growth and inflation. So even though growth is low, the economy is, quote, overheating, depending on your interpretation of the causes of inflation. And there are huge debates about what this is about. Oil shock, there's a lot. Sorry, can't cover it all. Okay. The New Deal consensus on full employment, a strong social safety net, etc., breaks under the success of the Republican Southern strategy. Ronald Reagan, who was regarded by many Republicans as far too crazy a candidate to run successfully nationally earlier in his career, wins a landslide election in 1980. Appoints a Fed chair who is monetarist, that is Paul Volcker. A new economic paradigm begins to dominate economic policy in the United States because the Republicans are strong nationally. And they go about doing as much as they can to dismantle the social safety net. Thus Reagan campaigning against, quote, welfare queens, etc. Okay? Some pretty nasty economic rhetoric, clearly racially tinged. The reason that Levy refers to this next era after the 80s in Reaganomics as the era of chaos is in contrast to the era of control, in which the role of finance is heavily policed in the US economy, or controlled, tamped down, so that finance doesn't play that large of a role. Take a look at this graph. This is the percentage of GDP represented by the financial sector in the United States. That is, how much of the total US economic activity is being done in financial services or by financial services companies. Notice, remember that Great Depression spike? Huh. Boy, it's almost like there was a pattern in which significant speculative investment gives way to huge boom or huge bust, right? This is before the Depression, this is the Roaring 20s. This is the Great Depression and the war. Okay, like there's recovery back to a level that is relatively similar to pre-20s boom. Oh boy. Keep in mind, because this is in the hundreds, this is like the top of this graph is 8%, not 0.08%. Okay, so 8% of economic activity, 8% out of US GDP in the mid-2000s is the financial industry. Now, this is the part where it's like, I have to tell you that you are obligated to watch The Big Short. If you don't understand anything about the financial crisis and the Great Recession, that is a great place to start. I don't have time to cover a lot of it, except to say that part of the role of the rise of finance in this economy and the unleashing of financial speculation and investment occurs along the lines of real estate and mortgage-backed securities. That is, the government-sponsored entities that helps to secure home ownership in the United States begin to compete with private offerings that become very lucrative to underwrite. Banks underwrite huge numbers of loans, originate to distribute. That is, there are companies that originate the mortgages, get them off their books, stick them together. They are presumed to be safe. They are not. Investment in real estate collapses, and this will be an elective. I'll do one on the financial crisis. I wish I could go into more detail there, but I should start wrapping up here pretty soon. Suffice it, the part that I wanted to say here is really more of this pattern of, to what degree is the activity in the U.S. financialized or focused on finance is connected to patterns of boom and bust and wealth inequality. Here are two other graphs for helping us to conceptualize this and why we are debating the inequality topic today. Okay, so why this topic now? Why the federal jobs guarantee as a proposal? Why basic income? Well, because this age of chaos name that he's given it is not just that capital is less controlled. Part of the argument being made in that book, and generally by the left-wing economic thinkers who are largely behind the job guarantee, many of whom are associated with MMT and some of the other things that you will discuss in lab, they make an analogy between prior periods of very significant inequality in the United States and the need to shift our economic thinking and our economic paradigm. This analogy is drawn in part based on graphs like this. These come out of a book from Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, one of the major scholars of inequality globally. Look at here, both early 20th century and then in the 1920s. This is the share of the top percentile, top 1%, of total economic activity in terms of income or wages in the United States. The orange line excludes capital gains. Okay? The green includes it, because it includes total income. Right here, the top 1%, as you can see on this chart, about 24 to 25% of national wealth. After the war and during the period of control by left-wing economic thinkers between 1940 and 1970, much, much lower, about half. 2010, which this should extend further on, that's my fault. We're back at levels not seen since the 20s or the 10s. So in terms of the long arc of US economic history and the struggles over the distribution of resources, we are in a position where a number of the features that helped generate economic crisis and difficulty, political crisis and political difficulty, plenty of the people who are interested in economic equality look at a graph like this and see very significant economic and political troubles for us in the future. This is a similar chart on the degree of income inequality. So this is the share of the top 10%. Same pattern. Hopefully, putting this in a part, this more, what I hope is a more dynamic political and economic picture. I know sitting there reading about tobacco plantations in the colonies or railroads in the 19th century may seem a little dry, but hopefully a bit more animated here in terms of why this is perceived as both an important policy area and a persistent aspect of the history of US politics and economics is the fight over the share of economic resources and their distribution. Okay? That's what I got. lab leaders, do we want to do questions for like 5 or 10 minutes, or do you want to just do straight to lab? 5, 10 minutes good?
Questions are great.
Okay, we'll do some questions and
The
then
more you talk, the more we'll learn.
we'll try and get out of here at like 3:30 or so. So questions, yeah. Okay, you're doing some good thinking there. Keynesian, it's a really weird word because Keynes is an odd name for pronunciation. Okay, John Maynard Keynes. But when you said countercyclical there, yes, in general, the set of stabilizing elements in economic policy that are associated with pursuing full employment, right? The set of, if you all, oh my God, a term that I should have had up on the board a long time ago. That hopefully I'll remember how to spell. Laissez-faire, let it be, okay? This is associated with the notion that the economy reaches points of, quote, natural equilibrium. If the economy runs itself without intervention, it will hit natural points of equilibrium. That is, as demand falls, things will become cheaper. That will promote additional investment. The economy will recover on its own. So the business cycle basically should be accepted as a natural fact of life. Keynesian economic thinking is strongly associated with what you refer to as counter-cyclical policies. That is, policies that are designed to stabilize the economy to mitigate the effects of the business cycle, the expansion of credit and the contraction of credit. Try and stabilize it so that it doesn't have those very, very large swings. So yes, that's a good connection to make. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? I would really love if everybody just like thoroughly integrated this like that, but I kind of doubt it. So let's, I'm also happy to take questions over. It's not like, it doesn't have to be stuff that I covered. It could be making additional connections to the current era, because I haven't done a lot of that, or like where this is going to show up in your cards. I haven't done a lot of that either. So I'm happy to take questions about that too. Yeah. Sorry, say that again.
Sorry, can you explain the significance of Democrats being able to take hold of the House and how that impacts the economy?
Well, so if you're to think about this as the contemporary era, right? Notice we've gone through a realignment here towards the end, right? Now this is the kind of the versions of the Democratic and Republican parties that you are familiar with. Okay, we got there. Yeah. The current economic policies that are being pursued by either party are relatively fractured. Like, part of the reason that this is such an odd political and economic moment in the United States is Trump represents a significant departure from some of the economic policies of the Republican Party of the past. Not all, definitely still supports tax cuts, etc. But Trump is not a free trade advocate. He pursued a trade war with China, high tariffs, right? Generally, it's like the free trade republicanism that is characterized by a new version of laissez-faire, which is one other way that you could describe neoliberalism. It's not quite right, but there's at least an analogy, okay? The Democratic Party, I would say, is currently split between, there are a number of very large business interests that are strongly represented in the Democratic Party, right? A lot of the high tech sector is Democratic, but Democratic much more towards the center. That is, they push a series of policies that they would describe as moderate, right? Whereas you have the more populist wing of the Democratic Party, Bernie, AOC, etc., who are some of the first people to bring up some of these other more radical economic proposals. So Bernie Sanders hired Stephanie Kelton, who's probably the most prominent MMT economist and representative in the United States, or representative of that school of thought in the United States. He hired her as a congressional aide. Okay, so you've got now in both parties, there is less consensus on economic policy in either party right now than in probably any recent era, certainly since 1945. Does that sort of answer your question? Okay. It's I can't give you the answer of like what exactly it means for either party to control, in part because the parties don't totally agree within themselves about what is to be done. Other questions? Yeah.
I've noticed that the gold standard has come up a lot throughout history. So, what are some ways that the gold standard might show up or be relevant in a debate context?
So, the modern monetary theory folks believe that too much current thinking in economics, even though like they don't accuse these other economists of like not understanding that the US is not on the gold standard anymore. They would say that the way that those economists model our economy, and in particular government budget deficits or government spending, is still tied to a world that is informed by the convertibility of currency into gold. So when part of their disagreement is like, where does money come from and what is it? Okay, like they accuse most orthodox economists as, even though they, like I said, they clearly understand that it's like you can't take your paper dollars into the Federal Reserve and convert them into gold, which you used to be able to do. Okay, but they accuse them of modeling the economy as though that is what is happening. Like the fear that the U.S. could run out of money because it can't borrow it depends to some extent on the idea that dollars are worth something because they are backed by the credit of others rather than by the full faith and credit of the government itself. Does that help?
Yeah, I get what you mean. Like, they still act like we're the gold standard, even though we have full control.
They model their understanding of government spending, according to this accusation, as though we were still talking about currency being backed by something rather than dealing with an advanced economy that is a fiat currency. So it's like, don't make that claim even you were phrasing it in the most broad way possible. It's like, it is a more, even though it does lead to some very distinct conclusions for some of the policy areas, you could, for instance, like, it's not as though to support a job guarantee, you have to be someone who also adheres to modern monetary theory. Those things oftentimes go together because of the way that those people think about the economy, but they don't have to. So like the New Deal programs that included, efforts at employment, like the WPA and the CCC, like Roosevelt and even his most radical economic advisors, it's not like they were still dealing with a world in which the U.S. had gone off the gold standard, but they wanted a return to like currency backed by something. And they still supported policies that were about, kind of trying to guarantee full employment. So those things are related. They are not the same. They're not synonymous.
So you're saying it's relevant because it's like informed orthodox like economics and the status quo.
That is that's one of their major criticisms, is like you haven't revised your economic thinking to take into account that we're dealing with a world that is fundamentally different from the prior era of the gold standard or gold-backed currencies or dollar convertibility into gold in a dollar system.
Why the gold standard end?
Okay, gold standard, why does it end? This is a complicated question, but the end of Bretton Woods, okay, that set of agreements, that the economic agreements and institutions that are post-World War II orchestrated by the United States. Okay, so when you see Bretton Woods in any kind of card, that's what it's, the Bretton Woods system, that's what it's referring to. It is assumed that you just understand that it's like referring to the period in which it's a dollar-based system, but the dollar is convertible into gold. A dollar-based system where the dollar is convertible into gold. Other currencies are convertible into dollars. Dollars are convertible into gold. Okay, that's Bretton Woods. Okay, how does Bretton Woods end? In part, okay, Nixon first suspends and then ends convertibility of the dollar into gold, because in order to back the dollar in gold, what do you have to do? Let's see if this can be a little bit of a tricky question, but like, what do you have to do to be able to back the dollar in gold? Do you have to have that much gold on hand at all times? So is it literally like, in order to have any of these bills in circulation, we must have the same amount of gold? Okay. Same thing with all banking in the U.S. that is a fractional reserve banking system. You don't have to have, if the bank had to have exactly the same amount of money at the bank as it takes in, that means that the bank is not loaning any of the money out. That's a mattress that's turned into a building, right? It's like we put the money there and it never goes anywhere except when we take it out. Okay, the bank loans out money that it receives. There's actually another significant economic disagreement that like many people believe that private banks actually don't act as intermediaries between depositors and borrowers. They believe that banks are creating. Just forget that last 2 minutes. That's an elective too. Okay, that's an elective too. But they have to have gold on hand. Not all the gold to back up all the currency, but enough gold that when someone comes to convert their currency into gold, that the gold is there. Yeah? So like not the same amount, but a lot. Okay? Sorry. Question? Okay. Nixon, gold window. There we go. Gold convertibility. Suspends gold convertibility, then ends it. Because, okay, a large number of people, as deficits rise and borrowing costs in the United States increase, the gold convertibility of Bretton Woods was a set peg. If I remember correctly, it's like $35 per troy ounce or something like that. Okay? Who cares? Convertible into gold. Okay? The price is such that like if you hold a lot of dollars, okay, or gold, you can bet in one direction or the other about the ability of the U.S. to borrow enough to maintain its currency peg. Peg just refers to the like, oh, we're setting it as it's that much, okay? So, a bunch of people in this era, internationally, who control large amounts of money, that's like, these are large banks, basically, large parts of the financial system, begin to bet against the ability of the United States to maintain the gold peg. That is, we're gonna get a lot of dollars on the presumption that we can keep using them to redeem for gold, to challenge you to come up with the gold to give to us, okay? So speculative currency investment, just the like, is currency going to go down? Can the U.S. maintain its gold peg? This is an era where there is a great deal of speculation that it won't be able to. So large amounts of gold are leaving the United States. The people are redeeming their dollars for gold. There are large amounts of dollars that have been exported internationally at this point because the U.S. has started to run a trade deficit. So in the 70s, this is like extra credit, okay? Which economies in the 70s start competing significantly with the U.S. such that the U.S. begins importing a lot more from those countries, and it didn't import almost anything from them before? Japan is one. Germany, okay? Notice, the countries that lost World War II, like Japan's economy at the end of World War II is obliterated. The U.S. has firebombed essentially every city in Japan and then dropped nuclear bombs on 2 out of the 4 cities that it didn't firebomb. Okay? The economic activity in Japan has collapsed. Germany, same thing. The Soviets, in East Germany, the Soviets took a bunch of East German factories and sent them back to Russia. It's just like, we're going to dismantle German industrial capacity because you all have nearly conquered our country twice, so you're not going to get to do it again. We're going to literally take a large portion of your economic plant and just move it into our country. Okay? So, those economies begin to recover, and in the 60s and 70s in particular, they develop significant high-tech manufacturing. So, like, this was a debate between my grandparents and my parents. My grandfather, who fought on the Pacific Front during World War II, there was no way he was ever going to buy a Japanese imported car. Just wasn't going to happen. My parents, I grew up with them driving me around in a Honda Civic. Very fuel efficient, much better than any American car produced in the late 70s or early 80s. Okay? That happens on a large scale that Germany and Japan begin to export a bunch of stuff to the United States very successfully and compete with large US industries, in particular the auto industry, the steel industry, right? The foundations of the era of control. Like all those big industries in the US, they're legacy industries by the 60s and 70s, which means that they're old. It's very expensive to invest to build new machines. Like Japan is building auto plants from scratch. They don't have any of the old technology, any of the old machines, any of the older unionized labor force. They compete very effectively with the United States. What does that mean that Japan and Germany end up with a lot of in the 70s? What type of money? Dollars. Because US consumers are paying for those goods in dollars. Dollars are being collected by the companies and countries that are exporting their goods to the United States. All those dollars are sitting outside of the US economy. What do you do if you worry about the strength of the dollar, but you have a bunch of dollars at the end of the Bretton Woods system? What do you do with your dollars? You can take them and exchange them for gold. If lots of people do that all at the same time, that is, they speculate on, I would rather have gold than have dollars, that to some degree is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's like, as the US begins to have to do more to maintain its gold supply, which is very expensive, right? Because now it's buying gold to attempt to maintain the gold supply, to redeem currency conversion into gold. That's why the currency pegged to gold is something that has to be, quote, you might read cards that are like defending the currency peg or defending the value of the currency. That's like, at this time, there is an attempt to say like, yeah, it's going to be redeemable in gold forever. We promise the same rate. Like, come on. But all of these dollars are circulating internationally that can be redeemed for gold. That makes it more expensive to maintain the gold peg. Nixon eventually says, we can't do this. So he suspends convertibility into gold. Did that answer that question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. That's one of those you probably got to review with like a couple of readings or some Wikipedia support or some other stuff like that. Other questions? Then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
Wait, so like if like that inequality stuff happened like before the Great Depression and then it like suddenly dropped, or like like you were like making a parallel between the Great Depression and us right now.
Yep.
Is that gonna happen within our lifetimes?
I mean, no, not in the sense that like these things. There's the like that adage about like history rhymes, it doesn't repeat, right? It's like you're looking for some degrees of pattern or like why is it that this would be something that is so politically concerning rather than the exact same thing would happen. So for one, like huge portions of the institutions of the federal government that exist now did not exist in the 1930s. So like. This is one of the things that made the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession very different from the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve acted as the lender of last resort, not just in the US, but also internationally. It supplied it supplied dollars, trillions of dollars of credit to European banks. And there were a bunch of mechanisms in place for, like, people had, Ben Bernanke, the chair of the Fed during the Great Recession, during 2008, 2009, wrote most of his like academic work was about the Great Depression and the causes of the Great Depression. So those policymakers perceive themselves as operating in an environment where it's like, we know what the Great Depression looks like, we are going to stop that at all costs. Okay? They did, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other problems with the solutions that they proposed. So one of the things that, if you look at some of these economic charts, the economic recovery after 2008 and 2009 is much slower. A shallow recovery rather than a like fast recovery. A bunch of the job guarantee people who discuss this as a stabilizing and counter-cyclical mechanism, they believe that providing both employment and thus stable demand, that does on the labor side what a lot of what was done on the financial side by the Fed. So like part of the reason that fiscal is in the resolution is that set of people emphasizes fiscal policy, that is spending by the government, as opposed to monetary policy as the way to drive a lot of the economy. Does that make sense? Is that, do you see it? It's like plenty of these people believe that this is the kind of thing that should have been in place during the Great Recession, rather than only the financial side of maintaining the financial system in the US by loaning trillions of dollars to banks. It's not like they think that those banks necessarily should have collapsed, although plenty of them maybe thought that they should have been nationalized, like the federal government should just run the banks, take them over. They messed up, government buys them. Sorry, you don't get to do it again. You know, that it's like on the financial side, this set of people has a different set of proposals as well. But one of the things that they definitely think is that our emphasis on 2008, 2009 was far too much on the financial side, not nearly enough on the side of labor and fiscal policy. They all think the stimulus bill was too small. This was the thing that Chris mentioned, the Christina Romer debate versus Larry Summers, where Summers is like, $1 trillion, you can't spend that. And then during COVID, we did that and a lot more. Does that help?
Yeah.
One more question, then we'll go. Or we can go down. It's okay. You all, like, overall level of engagement, questions, paying attention. I'm not, you know, it's like, I get that it's kind of from the fire hose, okay? Thank you very much. You did a really good job of paying attention. I appreciate the degree of attention considering that you just listened to an hour and a half straight on dry economic history. So thank you for that and enjoy a good time in Latin.